Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Comic Source. I'm your host, Jace. Real treat for you today. A treat for me as well. This is a bucket list creator who has been on the podcast once before to talk about his animated work. Specifically, we talked to him at New York Comic Con 2018 about the Constantine movie. But we're finally having him on a dedicated episode here to talk comics. It's Jam DeMatteis. Jam, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. How are you doing?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I always preface it this way, considering the state of the world, I'm doing just fine.
Well, that's good to hear. I've been sort of living in your world for these past few weeks, preparing for this. So reread Brooklyn Dreams, and then obviously your current Marvel work. You've brought Ben Reilly back in sort of an interesting time frame. So we'll talk about that as well. It's so interesting because this series is set during the Clone Saga, the infamous Clone Saga from Marvel.
It always has to be called the infamous Clone Saga.
It does. It does. Now, I don't say that to say negative things because there's a lot.
I understand. I say the same thing. It's okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of great stuff in there. But one thing that I find interesting is the fact that, again, it's sort of a nebulous thing. There are things that are sort of tangentially mentioned there that sort of modernize it. It's not specifically set in the 90s because then that would mean...
Right. That's one of the things we wrestled with, actually. It's like, okay, so, it's not the 90s. It's 5 years ago, Spider-Man time, So I had to dance around things like, what kind of cell phones do they have?
Right.
And then all these little bits of technology. So we just we moved around that stuff. So we couldn't pin it down to a particular year. But in my head, it's whatever it is. It's like, he was away for 5 years and maybe this is 3 or 5 years ago, that this happened.
Yeah. And it's right there on the first panel, first issue. It says like some time ago or a few years ago. It's not like there's a date, you're not.
Yeah. When my original script, it said 5 years ago. My editor said, let's not even be that specific.
That's fantastic. So obviously you have a huge, long history with Ben Reilly and with Spider-Man himself. So let's start with this. If someone were to come up to you and say, okay, and I know there's this new Ben Reilly Spider-Man series, the Humanity Agenda, what's it about? Like, what are you going for here?
I do have a long history with Ben, and I've said it before, but it's really, really true. When you write these characters, they stop being characters and they start being people. And just like in life, you have favorite people. You may like this person over there, but you really like that person over there. And Ben is one of those people that I just feel Peter too, very, very deep personal connection to. They're very, very real to me. As I've also said before, it's like, I know them better than I know some of my friends because I know every aspect of their psyches. I'm in their heads. I'm literally living in their heads, So the chance to bring Ben back, he's always been a character that's resonated with me. And, for those that know the Clone Saga, it's the whole idea was that there had been this clone. Ben comes back. He's the clone, upends Peter's life. And then at the point that this story starts, Ben has found out that he's not the clone. He's the real guy. He's been on the road for 5 years with no life under an assumed name. And now Peter and Mary Jane go off to Portland to have their baby. And Ben comes back to New York to be Spider-Man again. He's been the Scarlet Spider for, whatever it is, maybe it's 6 months in Marvel time, but now he's going to be Spider-Man again. But the problem is he can't be Peter Parker again because there is a Peter Parker out there with a wife and a child on the way who's living in Portland. So he's still this assumed name, this assumed persona, Ben Reilly. So he has no life, really, even though he's back. He can't turn back to old friends or family. Well, there's no family left. Aunt May has died. He can't turn to his old friends or his old life or his old work. The only thing he has is Spider-Man. But as Ben, he's absolutely nowhere. And a part of him, because he spent 5 years on the road thinking he is in his own mind, a worthless clone, not even human, part of him doesn't even think he deserves friendship or family or anything good in his life. So this story, along with all the super heroics and the slam and the bang, and we see lots of old villains show up, and there's a big mystery about who's behind it all, and there's a serial killer on the loose and all these things. But what the story is really, really about is Ben's journey, finding his place in this new life, in this new world, and opening up to people again. That's part, the title of the Humanity Agenda applies to Ben, and it applies to our antagonist as well.
So this is what's so fascinating to me about this, especially to set it back then, in kind of that time period of the Clone Saga, because we've had subsequent Ben series, right? Peter David did one. In fact, right now in the pages of Amazing, Ben is Spider-Man, and I know you don't have to be beholden to that. You're more thinking, okay, who is Ben at that time?
Yes.
But at the same time, there's also you can't go too crazy because we know obviously Ben survives.
Well, we can't change the future,
right?
But no one has explored this moment in time.
Exactly.
And it's a really important moment in time for Ben. So that's what we have. And so maybe we can't go wider, but we can go deeper, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's interesting to use that phrase, one moment in time, which has a lot of connotations with Spider-Man, specifically with his marriage, which brings me to another point. And it's this, again, idea of duality, and it's so meta because in my mind, it goes to the character of Ben and what was possible at the time. I've heard you in interviews talk about, yes, Ben was going to be revealed as the original. Peter Parker was the clone. He was going to go off, and it was going to be a brand new start.
Yeah.
New number one, new supporting cast, all that sort of stuff. And I know in a way it was, hey, let's have our cake and eat it too. There's a portion of the fandom that likes this idea of more freedom. He's not married. He's not tied down. You can go back to a more fun-loving, lighthearted Peter Parker and Spider-Man stories. But the dichotomy there is that Ben is a much darker character in a lot of ways because of what he's been to. Can you talk about that? Those things don't necessarily seem like they would mesh.
Right. Well, part of that with the rebooting would have been that journey back to that other aspect of himself, but they are. That's why I love the character. I always say he's Peter Parker, but he's not. He's been on the road for 5 years, and it has not, with rare exceptions, it has not been much fun. He has felt, alone, lost, worthless. He found love only to lose it. It's been a rough time. So he is Peter, but Peter turned and twisted a little bit and darkened quite a bit. And that's what makes him interesting. And yet at his core is that same compassionate, self-sacrificing, altruistic guy who will go to the farthest edge and over the edge to do the right thing, and that's what's so great about him. So the dichotomy is right within him, that he does have that darkness, but he also at his core has that light.
So will we in this series, obviously it's the beginning of that journey that you would have done back then. Are you going to have enough time in 5 issues to?
Well, not to totally transform him, but to take a major step forward. That's what this story is about, is Ben taking a major step forward. Yeah. By the end of the 5 issues, he's not the same guy that he was at the beginning of the 5 issues.
Gotcha. And then obviously I've heard you say you'd be open to doing more, even an ongoing.
Oh, I would love to do more. Yeah. I think there's more. Well, there's a certain amount, because just what you said before, because there's a certain point you're going to bump up against, the other events in Marvel time. But there's certainly room for another series or two in there, I would think.
Yeah, the other thing that's really fascinating to me, going back to this idea of Clone Saga, not only do we have Ben Reilly, obviously we have Peter Parker, we have Kane, who's this, was the first clone, deformed.
Another great character, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very, very complex. And then, this is spoilers, everybody, for the 3rd issue. Came out a week ago. Hope you've had a chance to read it. If not, pause this, go read it, come back.
Right,
we see Spider-Side. Spider-Side is back. As a clone as well. So in my mind, now you got 4. Now you got 4.
In my head, it's the brother. You see it back there. It's the brothers Karamazov. It's the brothers, the brothers Parker. You've got these 4 brothers, one of whom is sort of the bastard brother, like, Smerdyakov was in the brothers Karamazov, and that's Spider-Side. And, that's what part of me would love to do a series with the 4 of them and really play with the contrasts and the things that are wildly different, the things that are the same. I think that would be a great story to put all 4 of those characters in a story together, actually, working together and really exploring the differences between them.
Yeah, being forced to work together doesn't mean they necessarily get along.
Exactly.
Like in the brothers.
It's like real brothers.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Like real brothers, like the brothers Karamazov, which you mentioned Spider-Side as Smerdyakov, which to me, that's obvious. If you had to cast the other 3, and I know they don't really fit.
It doesn't really fit. I mean, maybe, well, Ivan is a bit wilder, so maybe Kane is Ivan.
Okay.
Maybe Peter is Alyosha.
Yeah, I think you'd have to go.
And Ben is Dimitri. That kind of works.
Yeah, it's not exactly. Yeah, they don't. There's a
Now
little rough edges.
now
You
we'll
got the
pause again
dialogue.
while everyone goes off and reads the Brothers Karamazov and comes back. Right?
Well, and that's what's
That
so
really works. I like that.
yeah, and that's what's so fascinating to me because anybody who's read that book knows that that is a book you can read over and over and get more and more out of it because the questions that Dostoevsky gives us, this idea of, why does God let bad things happen? If there is a God, why do bad things even exist? It's a question of faith and morality. These are not questions that even have answers. They're almost rhetorical, and it's asking us to think. And I know people sometimes don't give, I think all the time, most people don't give the comics medium enough credit. You can go and watch any number of videos doing analysis on, we're going to talk about William Blake's Tiger. You can watch that. You can go see Brothers Karamazov analysis. There's not too many people breaking it down intellectually. But the journey that you've been on, your whole life, looking for duality, looking for meaning, looking for spirituality, and you decided to become a writer, and a lot of your writing is in comics, but there's still value, there's still worth to these stories, right?
Right. We shouldn't even have to use the word still in there. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's like that outside point of view on what comics are, and I think people, of course, especially with superhero comics, they think even less of that. And yet at the same time, what's the most popular genre in the world right now? What got people out of their homes and back to the movie theaters with Spider-Man and Batman,
Mm-hmm.
So even there's the duality. People still, there were certain people that still like, it's really different though when I think about it, from go back even 10, 20 years and to now, because I think even in Hollywood, people that were like 12-year-old kids reading the Clone Saga are now studio executives or whatever. There's a whole generation of people out there in power who know and understand comics. The people that are making these movies for the most part are also fans. They understand the value of this stuff. And of course, comics isn't just superheroes. Comics is anything you want it to be.
Yeah, exactly.
It's anything. This idea that the public has that superheroes and comic books are one and the same when they're not. They're not even the same in my own career. I've done so many different things and worked in so many different genres.
Yeah, and there's so much value in story, from the earliest, our earliest beginnings as a species, we have told stories. And I think you can tell so much about where a society is at a particular moment by looking at what's important to them through the fictions and the fantasies that they
create. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I sometimes wonder if our stories sort of create the reality. The past few years, it's kind of felt like we've been living in some post-apocalyptic science fiction novel,
Right.
And you think about, 10, 15 years of like post-apocalyptic movies and books and everything. It's like we beat the drumbeat for it, and here it is. It's like be careful what you wish for on a level. It's an interesting thing. I think our stories are very, very important to us, not just as entertainment, but they nourish our souls and they express and create our worldview.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if you're familiar with James Tynan's Department of Truth from Image. But
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it. No.
Yeah, it's similar to that this idea the Department of Truth is trying to control what people believe, because if enough people believe something, if enough people believe the world is flat, the world becomes flat.
Right, and we have seen that literally in recent years. I mean, that it doesn't matter what reality is. And it's what the Nazis called the big lie, right? You repeat it enough and enough and enough, and people will accept it.
Yeah, perception is reality.
Yeah,
which is fascinating. Well, I want to go back to the third issue of Ben Reilly's. You change the line. You say "Spider, spider, burning bright," but it's one of my favorite poems, "Tiger, Tiger" by William Blake. Right. Everybody can see it on my background there, and Blake actually did the illustration of that tiger as well. I've always thought of it as
Blake did comic books, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Words and pictures. That's words comic books.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, so this is a poem. In my mind, it talks a lot about what fear is, and why. Again, going back to this idea of why bad things happen, just like Brothers Karamazov. The idea of the poem is, why would God create such a fearsome creature as a tiger when he also created something like a lamb? So. Right. You must be a big fan. I haven't necessarily heard you talk about William Blake. You must be a big fan. Is Tiger, Tiger something that speaks to you?
Well, I also want to say, but it's not just why did God create this terrible thing, but but I feel like there's also a sense of wonder about the tiger too. You know what I mean? It's not
Right,
just like,
yes.
oh God, this is an evil, horrible thing. This is a majestic thing that's capable of terrible things. But it's, you know, he's not hating the tiger in that poem. And as for William Blake, when I was 17, when I was a senior in high school, I had an English teacher that was very influential in my life, and he's the one that turned me on to William Blake. And there was something in there, and I could probably never express or explain it, but he, you know, he was a visionary. He saw, in a way, you know, in the art world, I love Van Gogh. It's like, and they both didn't just see reality; they saw into and through to other layers and levels of reality. You know, and that comes through in Blake's poetry. That comes through. Years ago, I went and I saw a Van Gogh show at the Met in Manhattan. And by the time I walked out, I was physically exhausted because there was so much, literally, energy coming out of these paintings, permeating my cells, you know, just because he had captured something so deep and so profound in those pictures. And Blake was the same way, you know, he saw into other layers and levels of reality. And I think when I was 17, I didn't really understand what he was getting at, you know, as life went on. I think I got to have more of a sense of what he was talking about those other layers and levels of reality. But you don't have to understand something necessarily to respond to it, you know, because there's always some part in here that gets it, even if your mind doesn't get it. And that's the way I responded to Blake. I just loved it instantly. And I'm not someone who's in love with poetry necessarily, but there are certain poets over the years that have jumped out. And Blake, and years ago also, I was in London for a convention, and there was a Blake show at a museum there, and they had his original art there.
Oh, wow.
It was incredible. It was just amazing. Loved it. Really, really loved it. So yeah, it's so funny, the spider thing. It's been identified with Kraven for so long. Sometimes I forget that it started with Blake. You know, it's like, oh, isn't that Kraven's poem? Wait a minute. No, that's William Blake's poem. What are we talking about?
Well, that's what's so fascinating to me, because again, it's going back to this idea of duality, which I always think we even need to take it a step further, because, you know, in so much of your work, it's about finding identity and kind of the war between making the good choices and the bad choices. We all have the capacity for, you know, great good and great evil, if you want to put it that way. But there's always, you know, levels and complexities.
Right.
And that idea of this poem for Kraven, in my mind, Kraven's Last Hunt was a lot about Kraven's fear, you know, fear of being irrelevant, fear of not being around anymore. And now you're bringing it in to the Ben Reilly story. And, you know, what is it that Ben fears? I mean, is that something that are you bringing this spider in to talk about the duality of Ben and to talk about what he fears?
You know, I didn't consciously do that, but that doesn't mean it's not absolutely correct. You know what I mean? A lot of times I'll read my stories later and I'll go, oh, wow, that's really interesting the way that connects to that. And this means that refers back to this. And my unconscious put it in there, but my conscious mind didn't. I just, you know, we have this Kraven corpse. So I thought, let's play with that poem a little bit. Because there is something menacing in that poem as well. There's a sense of wonder and a sense of menace in that. But what does Ben fear? I think Ben fears two things. He fears the life he's had, and he fears the good life that he could possibly have. And, you know, we all go through that at certain points in our lives, where the good could sometimes be more frightening than the quote bad that we know, you know, where the misery that we know is more comforting than an unfamiliar good. And I think that's true of Ben Reilly. And so the part of his program of like, oh, I'm not worthy, I really don't do friends, I don't connect to people, whatever, is because he desperately wants it and he's desperately afraid of it. And the other thing he's afraid of is what he's already got, which is to be alone forever. So he's caught between these two visions. It's good to talk about this because I honestly, a lot of times I don't think about these things. I let the characters lead me on and their psychology, their emotions take over, and I just follow it. So when we talk about it, I realize that I know more about the characters than I realize that I know, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's more there than you thought. Yeah. So it's almost like Ben is afraid. Obviously, he's afraid of the trauma that he's gone through and falling back into that. But the possible good life is an unknown. And we all fear the unknown to some extent.
Yeah, we do. And I've seen it in my own life sometimes, that the very thing that you want is also frightening because it's unfamiliar. And a lot of times we're terrified of the unfamiliar, even if it's an unfamiliar good.
Right. Exactly. Well, something else that I read into it, and maybe, you know, it sounds like you weren't necessarily thinking about it, but I think it works so well. The last line of the poem before it repeats the first stanza is, what the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? And in my mind, it felt like you were saying that the trauma and everything Ben's gone through 5 years on the road, he was being forged in a way, blacksmith, hammer, kind of that being analogous to God as at the forge creating a tiger. What the chain, he's chained to his past because he's always going to have those memories of Peter Parker. And then, in what furnace, and we all know fire purifies, fire, can help create. And so in my mind, it was almost like you were saying, okay, he has been through all of this. He has been hammered. He has been chained. He has been purified by fire. What can he now become? And I just found that fascinating. And also the last little bit of it, he's so angry in this story, right? Which oftentimes we will kind of equate to fire and furnaces and whatnot. So again, I just think even if you weren't conscious of it, that William Blake, those lines work perfectly, not only for Kraven, but also for Ben Reilly.
Right. And in a way they kind of work for Spider-Side too, it's, because he's on the same journey, and we'll see more of that as the story progresses. He's on a very similar journey to Ben. It's a much more demented version of that journey, because he's a much more sort of degraded, demented version of the clone, but it's a very, very similar journey. And the clones were literally forged in fire. It started somewhere with a little test tube with a flame under it, didn't it? So it's interesting. I have to be honest, one of the reasons why I used Spider-Side in this story, I didn't set out to go, it's like the Brothers Karamazov. I tumbled to that after the fact, was that I never liked the character. I'm being really honest. In all the Clone Saga stuff, I said, I just never didn't like the character. And I thought, let me go. I like to go to characters that I feel that have potential, but maybe that was not met. And then let's really dig in deep and let's make this character into something formidable. So that was my challenge with this story. And I thought it'll be great. Let me pick this character that I never liked, and let me bring him in, and let me, by the end, what happens when you connect with a character, then you fall in love with them. You take the character that you never liked and you fall completely in love with them because you have to become them while you're writing the story.
Yeah. If you're passionate about it, you're doing your job right as a writer, you're bringing relatability to that character for yourself so that you can understand them. And then that comes through to the readers, because I'll agree with you. I felt like the first go round in the Clone Saga, Spider-Side felt more like a plot device than an actual realized character.
Yeah, absolutely. And I never connected to it or even frankly understood what he was doing there. But, things happen along the way. But I was really glad to have the opportunity to take that character now and explore him. The interesting thing is that you have to invest these characters with as much of yourself to make them real. And then the paradox is, as soon as you do that, they become something completely independent of you with a life of their own. It's the great thing. And that's what you want as a writer. You want these characters to come alive and take control of the story and take off and lead you to places that you never expected.
Yeah, which is why, and again, we have a lot of aspiring comic writers here, and I know you do story consultations and workshops at times. I'm sure one of the things you tell aspiring writers, just because you outline something or think you have the idea for the end of the story in mind, you have to be willing to change it if the story dictates where you're going to end up.
Exactly. I always say it's great to have a map, but be ready to take out a match and burn the map. And my other tired at this point tired metaphor is that the story's like this horse, when you're on the horse and your goal is you're going 6 miles straight ahead and off you go. And then the horse starts pulling off to the left and no, I'm going to that town 6 miles this way. And you have a choice at this point. You can fight with the horse or you can let the horse go and lead you someplace completely unexpected. And the horse is always right. When your story rears up and surprises you, that's the greatest moment as a writer, when the characters say or do something that you didn't expect. That's what you want. Before we started recording, you mentioned Bwa-ha-ha, and I had a moment working on Bwa-ha-ha, which is to me the crystallization of that. And it's that I had one. This is when it was still a comic book before we did it as a book series, when it was a cross gen. And I'm working on the 3rd issue, and each issue opened with a prose piece. And I had the whole issue mapped out. I knew who all the characters were that were coming in and whatever. And I sit down to write. And as I'm typing, I literally type the name of a character I've never heard of before. And when I see it there on the screen, and it's like, it wasn't in my mind when I sat down to write, and suddenly this character appears on the page. So I'm like, all right, that's interesting. Well, I'll write this little bit of prose piece, and I got to get off and tell the story that I want to tell. So this character shows up. His name was Master Wicks, and I write a little bit about him in this thing, and then I move on to tell my story that I plan to tell for that issue. And the story just sucks. It's falling apart left and right. Buildings are collapsing around me, you know? And I realized, oh, this new character wants to be in this story. And I'm like, let me get through the first half and I'll bring you in later, or maybe I'll bring you in next issue, but just let me forget the story that I wanted to tell. I had a whole bunch of new characters I was going to introduce that I threw out. I brought in this new character that I'd never heard of before, and the whole story came together.
Amazing.
So then it's like, who created that character? I know I wrote the story, but I don't know where he came from. And that's when I think about the fact, and I don't mean this as a joke, that there is this dimension of story out there, and we're lucky enough to get this stuff beamed into our heads, mm-hmm. And we each have specific personalities and passions, so that story gets filtered through our personalities, but the story is out there, It's like looking around, how about that writer? How about that? Oh, I'll pick that guy, And with Bwa-ha-ha, it felt like it was that Bwa-ha-ha existed, and they were just sharing their story with me, and they wanted me to get it right. No, not that. We want Master Wicks, So, but those are the moments that you pray for, because I had absolutely no control of that. It was like magic to me. It's like, I don't know what this is, but I'm going to follow this when the message finally got through. And you always want that to happen with your stories.
Yeah, and you have to be receptive for it. In a way, it's similar to what I tell people when they ask me, well, how do I break in, or what do I need to be prepared? It's like anything in life. You prepare for your opportunity so that you're ready when it comes along, but you never know when that opportunity is going to come along. So success is kind of like opportunity meets preparation in a way.
Right, meets the cosmic whim.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's the same thing. It's not just the beginning of your career. It's all through your career. You always have to be open to happy accidents. I always look at I've had like a 20-year career writing animation. I never planned on that. It just sort of, one domino tumbled into another. And the next thing I knew, it was not in the plan. It wasn't something that I thought about or wanted to do. An opportunity came. And I discovered that I really enjoyed it, and the work was successful, and one thing led to another, and this whole other stream opened up for my career. But it was never in the plan, but I was open to the possibility. Always, same thing with the horse. You're going that way, but maybe you run into a barrier on the way, so you have to go left, and suddenly there's an archway that leads you to a whole other world. And that happens in careers. It happens in life, and you have to be open. You can't keep trying to bang your head against the wall because you still want to go that way. You have to go with the flow and kind of go through that doorway and see where it leads.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and it's so, in a way, it's so spiritual to be open, it's like, hey, I need to be receptive to the universe. I need to have my antennas up. And I know I've heard you tell this story a lot too, and you even mentioned in Brooklyn Dreams that you could just lose hours just laying on the floor, staring at the ceiling, making up stories. In my mind, that's you with your antennas up.
Yeah, I guess it is. It took me a while to figure that out too, that it was okay. Very early on, I learned that for 99% of the time, writer's block doesn't exist. Writer's block is just your unconscious working on the story. Your conscious mind is frustrated and thinks it's not working. Just go lay on the floor for a while. Go take a walk around the block. Give your unconscious the time and the space. When I was working years ago, when I was working on Moonshadow, and we did the first 2 issues, and at that point, it was the best thing I'd ever done. I was like, I can't believe how good this is, and I'm working with John J. Muth, this amazing artist, and I'm in the 3rd issue, and I'm 2/3 of the way through, and I hit a wall. And it's like, oh my God, the story's, same thing with Bwa-ha-ha, the story is falling apart all around me. And now everyone's going to know I'm a fraud and a fake, and the first 2 issues were a fluke, and I'm a terrible writer and the whole thing. But I had not yet tumbled to the fact that I just needed to let my, so what I did was I wandered around the house for days, depressed and miserable and anguished, and then laid on the floor, not out of like opening the door to my unconscious, but just because I had no choice. I was so wasted, I had to just lay on the floor. And I'm laying on the floor, and this movie starts playing in my head, and there's the whole ending of the story that I was looking for. Changed the whole story. It was perfect. And I went, oh, okay, just relax and be open to this stuff. And that's what happens too. It's like movies start playing in my head. And you hope that when you get to the computer that you can capture what you just saw. as I always sometimes think, wouldn't it be great to just jack your head into the computer and download the movie, you know? But it doesn't work that way, although it may work one day, but I don't think I'm ready for that anyway. But it's, though, again, those are the moments that you live for.
Wow, in a way, you're telling that story about, you know, first two issues are out, you feel like that you've nailed them. This has Ben Reilly. You're almost afraid of your success. You've done so good. Now there's pressure.
That's right. That's right. It's true. And I think we all go through that because we're all human. You know, it doesn't matter how successful you are. I always say the great thing and the worst thing about what I do for a living is every story is the first story. Because every time you start a new story, you're starting from the blank page. You have to build the world from the ground up. Now, yes, I've been doing this for a long time, so I have a certain set of skills I can depend on. Mm-hmm. But the skill set without the inspiration to go with it, you know, I will construct a story for you with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the character will move from point A to B to C. But you don't want just the structure. You want that structure filled with inspiration and something real and authentic and meaningful.
Yeah, you want that spark of imagination to really bring it to life. Yeah. Well, let's bring it back to the Ben Reilly series you're currently doing. So when Marvel approached you, did you know right away, okay, well, Spider-Side, that's where we're gonna go?
Not long after. I mean, when they approached me, you know, and I say this only half jokingly, I heard the words Ben Reilly. I was like, yes, you know, I didn't even have to wait to ask any other questions because I was just so happy to be reunited with my old friend, you know. And then I just sat down and started thinking about that, you know, where the characters at that time, that era, and kind of what we were talking about before. Well, I never liked that character, so let's make him someone I like. It was kind of similar in a weird way to what happened with Kraven, because before we did Kraven's Last Hunt, people didn't really care about Kraven that much. He was sort of a B-level Spider-Man villain.
He was a mustache twirler.
Yeah, and you know, the only reason I even thought of using him at the time was because I was reading a Marvel Universe handbook, and someone had written in there, which I had never seen in the story, that Kraven was Russian. And because of my love for Dostoevsky and the Brothers Karamazov and Crime and Punishment and all, I went, oh, he's Russian. And all of a sudden, this character turned into a three-dimensional human being for me. And that's why I had another villain planned for that story. Threw the other villain out and brought in Kraven. And then he became something that for me, he had not been before. So that's, you know, what I wanted to do with Spider-Side. You know, the readers will decide whether I succeeded or fail. But that's what I tried to do at any rate. I wanted to make him, you know, interesting and nuanced and layered. And I think he is a fascinating character. And I don't want to say more because I don't want to give away anything for the next two issues. But I do want to write that story with the four of them.
Yeah. And I want to read that story. And I mean, I thought it was fascinating. I love your work. I'm a huge fan. And so reading this Ben Reilly series and wondering, who is this villain? Spider-Side, I could have guessed 1,000 guesses. I wouldn't have guessed Spider-Side. Right.
Well, I think a lot of people don't even know that the character exists or don't, you know, barely remember the character. You know, he didn't make a big impact back then. So, you know, you're going to get to that last page and it's not going to be like, it's Dr. Doom, you know, it's going to be like, really? You know, I'm not trying to hit you over the head because look at this amazing villain that I trotted out that's going to blow your mind. You know, it's the surprise that it is this sort of odd, off from the center character stepping into the spotlight now. But then within the context of Ben and his story, it makes perfect sense because he's the ignored brother.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes it so amazing. You know, you could have created a new villain and, you know, had, you know, a great design from David Baldione, who's a fantastic artist. And
he's amazing.
Yeah. And it would have been, you know, great. But it's the fact that you're pulling from, you know, this shared history. And when we talk about shared history, at the time the story is set, it's not that much shared history, but yet meta, it's all, you know, decades of publishing for Spider-Side, for Spider-Man, for Ben Reilly.
Right. Exactly.
So you're mining something that's so much more interesting. But I want to go back to something that you said about Kraven and having him come to life for you, which I find interesting for readers that don't know. Originally, Kraven's Last Hunt, you know, the bones and structure of the story weren't necessarily intended for Spider-Man. So Batman story originally, right? Did you have a villain in mind when it was going to be a Batman story?
You know what it was originally? The germ of it originally was a Wonder Man miniseries, believe it or not. It was about Wonder Man and the Grim Reaper. Tom DeFalco, God bless him, turned me down. Because if he had said yes, we wouldn't be talking about Kraven. We certainly wouldn't be talking about, Wonder Man's Last Wonder today or whatever, the Grim Reaper's Last Reap. But I liked the idea that was in that story, which was the guy with the hero buried alive and coming, having, weeks, actually in the Wonder Man story, it was 6 months of his life taken away. So I played with that a while, and I developed it as a Batman story, originally with Batman and the Joker. Got turned down, as I recall, by Len Wein because they were starting to develop the Killing Joke, and he thought there was elements in what I was doing with the Joker that overlapped there. So the Joker elements, like 10 years later, I did for DC and Legends of the Dark Knight for one of my favorite stories called Going Sane, Batman Going Sane. So never throw your ideas away, kids. You can always find a way to get them out there. So I took it back again. I recast the story with Hugo Strange instead of the Joker. And that's where the villain putting on the hero's costume idea came from. And Denny O'Neil was now the Batman editor. And my memory is, so this has got to be 85 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Denny's answer was, this is good, but we already have our Batman graphic novel for this year, because graphic novels were very, they do like, here's the Batman graphic. Maybe they had 2 of them or something that came out.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it next year. So now I've been rejected by Tom DeFalco, Len Wein, Denny O'Neil, 3 great editors and great guys, and they all sent me packing. And then the opportunity came up. I was approached by Tom DeFalco again and Jim Owsley, who we know today as Christopher Priest, who was an editor at Marvel at the time, to take over Spectacular Spider-Man. They said, we want Mike Zeck to draw it. And I was like, I would, A, I love Spider-Man, and B, I would work with Mike on anything, because we had done 2 years together on Captain America. And I thought, well, maybe this is the place where I can take this story and build it out. And so I created a whole new villain, sort of like Marvel's version of Hugo Strange, mm-hmm. and started building the story that way until I came across that thing about Kraven, and I called up Alison. I said, forget this new villain. I'm using Kraven. But he was like, but I like the new villain. I said, no, I'm throwing him out. And to this day, honest to God, I don't remember anything about the character, his name, what he did, why, anything. And Kraven just took over. And because Mike and I had worked together on Captain America, where we created Vermin, I thought, and we needed something in the middle to contrast Kraven's view and Peter's view of being Spider-Man, I brought in Vermin as well. And Vermin, of course, is a big part, or at least his human self, Edward Whalen, is a big part of the Ben Reilly story. Yeah,
I love that you brought Vermin in too, because he's almost the agent of chaos in that story, the view of, hey, life just sort of happens to you.
You mean in Kraven's Last Hunt?
Kraven's Last Hunt,
yeah. Mm-hmm. And he is the focal point where you see the difference between Kraven's approach to what he thinks is being a hero and Peter's approach. Yeah,
it's fascinating. And again, anybody who's not read Kraven's Last Hunt, I don't know that you can call yourself a comic fan. I mean, you can. Don't get me wrong. Read comics in whatever way you want, as long as you're reading them. But Kraven's Last Hunt is seminal reading for sure. I do want to go back to something you said. I'm fascinated at Wonder Man and Grim Reaper, because for those listeners that don't know, again, we're getting back to the idea of brothers and this idea of duality.
Very true. And in a way, what I was thinking about in that story, which, I'm not someone who saves stuff, so I can't open a drawer and find those notes or the proposal or anything. Mm-hmm. But, it's brothers. It's in a way, it also plays into Peter Parker and Harry Osborn. 2 people that love each other, but are completely at odds, and to me, that's the essence of great drama right there. That's why I much prefer the Harry Osborn Green Goblin to the Norman the Green Goblin, because Peter and Harry loved each other, and yet they were mortal enemies for a time, and all the drama that goes with that, all the emotion, all the psychology, all the little nuances. It's the stories kind of write themselves when you have something like that. And I think that's what I was going for in that Wonder Man story. It's funny, we were talking about before the things you do consciously or unconsciously. And I remember early in my career, I'd written a bunch, maybe a year or two worth of stories at Marvel, and I started to look back, and I didn't realize that I was obsessed with themes of family and fathers and sons and brothers and all that stuff, And then I started looking, there are themes here. And that's true. Every writer, whether they realize it or not, we have certain obsessions, certain themes that obsess us, and they will run through your work. No matter how diverse your work is, no matter how many genres you're working in, you're going to see the same themes cropping up again and again and again, because those are the things that compel us and obsess us in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's why I identify with your work so much, because it's this idea of who we are.
Yes.
Which so many people think, okay, well, in high school, college, those are sort of your formative years, maybe even junior high, you're trying to discover who you are. I don't think we ever stop trying to discover who we are, because our roles in life.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah, our roles in life, okay, this is when I've become a boyfriend or a husband or a father, but then grandfather, or you meet new people and you're sort of searching for who does that person see me as? Who am I?
Right, and who am I in relation to them? And we're many different people in different situations. I'm one person hanging out with an old friend. I'm one person, hanging out with my wife. I'm another person. If I'm at a convention meeting fans, I have to be another person, and yet there is a thread of something beneath that, which is a continuity of who we are. But yes, we're always redefining that. And that question, it works on so many levels. Then there's who I think I am versus who maybe I really am. And those are hard questions to ask sometimes too, when you have to see the dark side in yourself. Well, I see myself as this wonderful guy, but I just did this thing and I hurt this person's feelings. And, and that's why I love stories of identity. I love, a lot of the old Twilight Zone episodes were always about, the guy thinks he's one thing and it turns out he's something else. And Philip K. Dick plays with identity all the time. And then there's the bigger question, not just who am I in an emotional or psychological sense, but in a cosmic sense. Mm-hmm. Why am I here? Who am I in the universe? What is, that becomes not just the search for self, but the search for meaning. So on all those levels, those are the things, for good or ill. And I know there are probably people out there that like, oh God, it's that theme again. I don't ever want to read that story again. And that's okay. Nobody's going to like everything. But these are the things that always obsessed me from the time, I was a teenager. And you're right. It doesn't change when it's still there through our whole lives. It's not just, the fact that sometimes people say, yes, well, those are the things you think about in high school and college, but then you move on and become a grown-up or whatever the thing is. I think you move on into denial, perhaps, some people. And they think, well, this is, it's like that 50s thing now, husband, father, I go to work and that's who I am. We're a lot deeper and more complex than that. You always have to keep asking those questions and challenging yourself. And it's not an easy process, because sometimes it's a painful process and sometimes it's an exhilarating process. But it's really important to our growth as people on this planet, I think. Yeah,
I'm glad that last thing you said there, growth. That's the thing. It's about growth, right? Because if you think, okay, I'm just finding, I just need to figure out what my career is, or have the family and the house and the dog and the kids and whatever. Now I've answered that question. It's not that simple.
No.
Because if you figure I answered the question, I don't need to think about that or deal with that or evolve or grow, then you've stagnated. You've stopped evolving. You've stopped learning. What's the point? What's the point of being around anymore?
Exactly. And we all go through periods of stagnation, and sometimes life shocks us out of that stagnation against our will, and it feels like a terrible thing at the time, and sometimes that terrible thing turns out to be the best thing that ever happened, because it does challenge us to answer those questions and redefine ourselves for the next part of our lives. Well, we're getting pretty heavy here from starting out talking about Spider-Man.
Yeah. But this is the stuff I love, JM, because here's the other thing. We've talked so much about duality or searching for identity. Here's the thing. In your work, there's a duality that's meta there. And what I mean by that is I can read these stories. I can read Child Within. I can read Kraven's Last Hunt. I can read your current Ben Reilly story. And I can just read it for entertainment at the surface level. And that's fine if that's what I enjoy. But then there's a deeper meaning there. There's a duality to the story. If I want to spend time thinking about these themes that you may not have even consciously put in there, they are there.
Right. And I think that's the fun of popular entertainment, is that the best popular entertainment will do just that. You'll get to go on a fun ride, but that doesn't mean it's not going to ask the challenging questions and have you think about things, in a deeper way. That's what I hope is the best stories will do. Dickens was an entertainer. Mm-hmm. Actually, so was Dostoevsky, really, because he also published a lot of his stories the same way Dickens did in these little chapter of his things, magazines and things like that. Which means you got to bring people along for the ride. You got to have the break before the commercial, basically, to have them come and buy the next issue. So you want to entertain people and you want to make them think, and those things don't fight each other. They should go together hand in hand.
Well, what I love so much as well, I always say comics that make me think, but the best ones, I'm enjoying it in the moment for entertainment, but I come back to it later and then I realize
Right.
hey, there was something there. If I'm still thinking about it the next day or the next week, something that I pick up on, again, comics aren't cheap, the cheapest entertainment. So that's more value if it's keeping your mind
Right.
engaged.
Right. Yeah, I was talking to a friend about that recently because, because I write that and I don't think a lot about the price. And then you look at the price and you go, I think of, being a kid when, 15 cents, 25 cents, you could buy a comic.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to follow a lot of comics now, man, that's a huge dent.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do that month after month, you got to really budget for that. So I appreciate anybody that's going to reach into their pocket and buy anything I've written because it ain't cheap anymore.
Yeah. But again, everybody, I encourage you to check out some of the stuff that we're talking about today, because again, it's so much value for your comic dollar. Well, we have to talk a little bit about the other side of the street. You've mentioned some of your work at DC. Maybe the other thing, other than Spider-Man, that you're so well known for is Justice League International, Bwa-ha-ha era, however you want to label it, that you did with Keith Giffen, and brilliant artwork by Kevin Maguire, best facial expressions in the industry.
Ever. Yeah, the best acting on the page that anyone has ever done, which is meant as no insult to any other artists out there. Everybody's got their strengths, and Kevin's strength is the acting on the page.
Yeah, 100%. So I had Jerry Conway on not too long ago, and he was talking about the challenges. He did an almost 9-year run on Justice League, and there was a time where new Teen Titans had come out, and it was going gangbusters, and DC was putting pressure for him to kind of change the way Justice League was going, and then eventually it just got to the point where he wasn't having any fun, and he left. So my question is,
and I came along.
Yeah, actually, and you came along.
I finished off that run.
Yeah, and that's what I want to talk about. Did you know that you and Kevin and Keith were going to do a kind of a lighter-hearted Justice League when you finished off that run?
Not at all. Andy basically was stuck at that point, and they knew that book was ending.
Mm-hmm.
So Jerry, I think, had an issue that he plotted that he wasn't going to dialogue. So I came in and dialogued that under a pseudonym, as I recall, and then finished off that 3-part or whatever it was. And then they said, we want you to basically do the end of Justice League Detroit. We want you to kill off some characters, blah, 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 blah. So I worked on that story, which I think was a 4-part story, and I thought that was done. And then around the same time is when Andy approached me and said, we're doing this Justice League thing. Keith was going to write the whole thing himself. He doesn't feel confident enough to write it. We want someone to come in and dialogue it. And I've told the story before, but it's, I'll tell it again. I read Keith's plot, which had a lot of dialogue in it. And I thought, this guy doesn't need me. This is so good. They basically dragged me kicking and screaming onto that book. We talked earlier about the situation where you think it's something negative and it turns out to be a great thing. I got dragged kicking it. Andy Helfer, he's almost like a Jewish mother. He can get you to do anything, a little bit of guilt, a little bit of food. There you go. You're done, And Andy cajoled me into this thing, kicking and screaming. And it turned into one of the greatest gigs and greatest collaborations of my career because Keith and I, and often with Kevin too, over 30 plus years, continued to collaborate. So I'm grateful that Keith didn't have the courage to do all the writing himself, because he's a terrific writer on his own, as we know. But he hadn't really fully branched out yet. And, the great thing about that book was there was just chemistry there. It just happened. And you say, did you know they were going to be doing a funny book? When we started doing the book, we didn't know we were going to be doing a funny book. That wasn't the plan. No one sat me down and said, and we're doing a lighthearted Justice League. If you look at the early issues, there's humor there, but it doesn't get quite as wacky as we got as we went along. We discovered that as we went along through the characters. Keith, by his nature, is always going to have humor in his stuff. And we're collaborating, so I'm reading the plot. Oh, so all right. And my job was to take those balls and spin them, and get the characters talking to each other. And so I pick up on Keith's humor, and then these guys start talking to each other, and goes back to what we were saying earlier about the characters taking over. And, people say, did you plan on making Beetle and Booster this central comedy team? No, they were in a scene together. They started talking to each other. They hit it off, and we went, oh, that's nice. Then Keith started putting them in the plots more. I had them talking more, and they became that on their own. We followed their lead. And that's what happened with the book. The humor just sort of evolved naturally. And that we had Kevin who could handle that. I always say, if Kevin hadn't been drawing that book, for that first year and a half or so that he did. And we had lots of other great artists. I don't mean to minimize them, but Kevin set the template. And if he had not been drawing that book, we might not be having a conversation about it today. And other artists could have been great, but he might not have captured what Kevin captured in terms of the interactions and the humor and the reactions. The acting, a lot of the acting is in the reacting and the takes and the facial expressions. So, Kevin was such an important part of that success.
Yeah, it really was lightning in a bottle. And the other thing that I think about, and this goes all the way back to what we were saying about Marvel possibly wanting to replace Peter Parker with Ben Reilly to go lighter. Your Justice League starts 87, 88. That's on the heels of things like Dark Knight Returns in 86 and Watchmen, where comics all of a sudden they're more serious and they're more dark. And then you guys come along and you're taking almost the flagship title of DC in Justice League. And yeah, not that you necessarily started out to make it funny, but I think you guys always wanted to make it relatable. And you gotta, life is this cosmic comedy sometimes. You got to be able to laugh and not take yourself seriously. And I think you guys really tapped into something special and ran with it.
Yeah. And believe me, we had no clue. We really, whenever someone says what was the plan, Keith always says, and it's true, there was no plan. There was no plan other than to tell good stories to the best of our ability. And what happened with that book, there was a chemical reaction and between the creators, and I include Andy in that because Andy Helfer, our editor, was a really important part of that book and keeping us all in place because, however much dialogue you see on the page, I probably wrote a lot more. And Keith's instinct is always to jump off the edge of the cliff, and Andy and I had to pull him back sometimes from going over the cliff, and he had to chain Kevin down to get him to draw those pages and get him in on time. So Andy was an important part of that, but it just sort of happened. You can't make that happen. Maybe there's some genius out there who's going to sit down and go, I'm going to do a groundbreaking whatever, and it's going to last for decades, But it never, it's an accident. It's always an accident. And the important part of that chemical reaction is the audience. Because I've had things that I've done that I think are some of the best things I've ever done, but they might not have ignited the audience. Mm-hmm. Whereas something else, Justice League to me, it was another gig. I had fun, but I wasn't like thinking, oh, this is really great. It was just fun. But the audience embraced it and has continued to embrace it all these years later. And that's the phenomena that always delights me with both this and with Kraven too, to see all these years later, people reading this stuff for the first time and discovering it for the first time and coming up to me at conventions saying, I just read this last week. It was great. That's what you hope for, And back in those days, we weren't thinking about trade paperbacks and hardcovers that would be reprinted again and again and again. I don't know how many times Kraven's been reprinted. I think there's another one coming up soon. We didn't know. We didn't have a clue. It was just a gig. Even Kraven, I poured heart and soul. You always pour heart and soul into the stories. But once that story was done, I didn't think about its future. I didn't think about anybody remembering it. I'm a freelancer. I'm on to the next gig. It's just the way it works,
Well, creators of your generation, it's got to be surreal because when you started out, comics were still, I don't want to say underground, but I mean, even when I was a kid reading, I didn't, advertise the fact that I read comics. I'd get beat up on the playground, Right. Now they're the center of pop culture.
Yes.
And it's fantastic.
It is. It's amazing, really, when you think about it. It's true. When I started in the business, I remember, relative saying, so this is just like a side gig on the way to what you really want to do. And yes, I had lots of other things I wanted to do, but it wasn't a side gig. I did it because I was passionate about it and I loved it, and yeah, right. And now kind of what we talked about before, all those kids reading comics are the grown-ups now ruling the world, and they love comics, and it's taken over. If someone would have told me when I was a kid that I could turn on my TV virtually any time between streaming and network and find superhero TV shows to watch, that, pandemic aside, I could go to the movies. There was a period, before the pandemic hit where it felt like every other week you could go to the movies and see another superhero movie or another movie based on a comic book. My head would have exploded if you told me that when I was a kid, because what did I have? The Batman TV show, the George Reeves Superman, that was it. Every once in a while, something would pop up, something else they'd try, and it was usually something stupid, But it didn't happen, and now it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and it's just an accepted genre, which is great.
Yeah, it's fantastic because again, there's so much value to these stories, whether you want to read it on the meta level, or the surface level, like I said, for entertainment, or the meta level to get deeper. Well, I know we're running out of time here, Jam. We have to talk a little bit about Brooklyn Dreams.
Sure.
I go back and forth on whether that's my favorite thing you've ever done. It's much more autobiographical. It's much more kind of slice of life. And I think I've heard you say that it's one of the favorite things that you have done.
Yeah. It's, I go back and forth between that and Moonshadow, and it's sort of like with my Beatle is it Abbey Road or is it the White Album? And I keep flipping back and forth, but, for obvious reasons, Brooklyn Dreams is near and dear to my heart, despite the fact that names are changed to protect the innocent. Mm-hmm. It's purely autobiographical, and it's funny because we're talking to a publisher right now about a new edition. Publisher about a new edition. And so I just had a meeting on Zoom with this company and with Glenn Barr, the artist who Glenn and I got on the phone last week. I hadn't talked to him in years, decades, So it's been really nice to see Glenn again and be talking about this project and looking through the files to see what I have and what he has from back when we were working on it. But yeah, that was a story that came about when I was working on Moonshadow at Epic, which was my first sort of major creator-owned thing. And in Moonshadow, Moonshadow's mother was this hippie chick from Brooklyn, mm-hmm. And there would be these little slices of Brooklyn life from when she was growing up. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to just do a whole story that way? So I actually pitched it to Epic first. It was called Senior Year because it was going to follow the main character through his senior year with lots of digressions. And for whatever reason, we never did it at Epic, but I kept it in my back pocket, which you have to do when you're a writer. You keep everything in your back pocket because you never know when the opportunity will come. And then DC was launching before Paradox, Piranha Press it was called. A guy named Mark Nevelo was running it. And I pitched him, I took out the idea, I did a rewrite on the proposal, and he really loved it. And I had something in my head of how I wanted the artwork to look. A little bit of Eisner, sort of like a Eisner of another generation in a way, you know what I mean? An Eisner of my generation. And he opens a drawer, and I still remember this, and he pulls out Glenn Barr's artwork. And it's like, well, that's exactly what I was seeing in my head. And there was this beautiful, perfect melding and molding of his sensibility and mine. And he visually told these very intimate stories of my life in this incredible way. And it was just what we said before about chemistry. It just happened. It's not like Glenn and I were hanging out all the time, getting to know each other. We're best pals. It just happens on the page. The same thing with me and Keith. Back in the day, we weren't close friends or anything. We'd see each other up at the office. Andy'd take us out to lunch. We'd have an occasional phone call. But we were too busy working to we didn't really become friends till years later when we got back together on formerly known as the Justice League, and we talked regularly. And, I talk to Keith regularly to this day. I just spoke to him the other day. But you don't need personal chemistry to have creative chemistry. Mm. And with Glenn, it really was this amazing creative chemistry that just happened. And so, yeah, this story is very near and dear to my heart. And so I'm so excited that we have this potential to get a new edition out. We want to make it. A couple of years ago, Dark Horse put out a definitive edition of Moonshadow with beautiful paper, beautiful hardcover, all kinds of extras in the back. And we want to do something very similar with Brooklyn Dreams. Really, really make it the edition that is definitive.
So when you went back and looked at it again recently, talking about a new edition, which is fantastic because yeah. I have the singles and they're not in the best shape. I'd love to have a nice hardcover or collected edition for my bookshelf. But when you went back and looked at it recently, anything that surprised you about the way you did the story? You wrote it so long ago. Any things, I forgot I did it that way, or you even forgot the memory that it was based on?
Right. Surprised? What was interesting was, on one level, it was the easiest thing I ever wrote because these were stories that I had told my friends for years. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it was the most difficult thing I'd ever written because these were personal stories that I've been telling my friends. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. This was like, there's no filter between me and the audience. This is just me. And you're getting into things that are very, very personal. I remember at one point writing and feeling like, I'm on a tightrope here. Do I really want to be up here? But you need to breathe through those moments and go through it. And so what I say, I don't think it surprised me. What I've learned over the years is, you go back and I'm going to reread anything. I'm going to find things in there that jump out. The two things happen. One of two things happen when I read an old piece of work. One is I go, oh God, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, if I could just tweak that line, or that doesn't make sense, or whatever it is. The other thing is, how did I write that? That's so good. I don't think I could do that now, you know? So there's that duality again. And what I've learned over the years is just try to respect the writer that I was at the time. There was a long time when I looked at my early work, very early work in comics, and I was very sort of condemning of it in some ways. And actually fans have helped me with this and going to conventions, because people come up with those stories that I had problems with, and they tell me how much they love that story and how much it meant to them and still means to them. It's like, oh, so there was value in that stuff. Because sometimes, you know, you look at your own work and all you see are the flaws. You don't see the good stuff. And so I've learned to respect who I was when I wrote whatever story it was. And Brooklyn Dreams is one that it holds up. And yeah, probably if I wrote it today, would I write things differently? Always, because you always hope that, you know, you're growing, you're evolving, you get a different perspective. But, you know, you got to let these things stand on their own. And you know, it still remains one of my favorites, if not my favorite thing I've ever done.
That's so interesting to hear, you know, and I do hear comic creators a lot that are their own worst critics. And you have a big love of music, you know, wish we had time to dive into that. But, you know, writing things critically, you know, as a music critic. And one of the things that I always say, whether it's you're reviewing music or comics or a movie or TV, whatever, nobody sets out to make a bad thing. They're pouring their heart and soul into this. Like you said, respect that creator. You know, you can be critical of something that you didn't like. Maybe it doesn't work because it's not for you. It's for a different audience. There's never reason to
there's value in there. If somebody likes it, then there's value in it.
Exactly.
And, you know, I was thinking, literally thinking about this today. Back when I was a music critic back in the day, many years ago, I always, for the most part, tried to be fair. But every once in a while, there'd be a review that like existed for the sheer snark of it, you know, which now I would never do in a million years, you know. And really, that's never merited. It's never merited. You know, if I want to go back in time and change something, I would go and destroy those reviews, you know, and rewrite them. And everything has value because it doesn't have, you know, there's plenty. I'm very, very opinionated in my private life. I try not to be opinionated in my public life because I respect the work, you know, just what you said. You watch a TV show or a movie. Do you know how much work went into that? Or that book that you didn't like, that guy sweated on for years? Mm-hmm. So if I don't like it, instead of bitching about how much I don't like it, let me focus on the thing that I do like, and celebrate that instead of denigrating the thing that I don't like. Because and frankly, the older you get, the more of a waste of energy that is. You know, we have a finite time on this planet. Do we want to spend it, you know, stewing in our negative juices, or do we want to focus on something positive? And especially when you get into, you know, with comics and TV and movies and our favorite books, these are things that ignite our passions and make us happy. So let's celebrate the things that we love. At the same time, I have to say, I appreciate a good critic, someone who really takes the time and is insightful. And if I read a review of something of mine and it's negative, but they have something of value to say, and they're not doing what I did back then and just being snarky for snarky's sake, you know, I appreciate that. Yes, deep in my heart, I want everyone to love everything I've ever done. But that doesn't work that way. It's never going to happen. You know, it's just never going to happen. I don't care who you are, you know, it's just never going to happen. There's nobody that's so universally loved that someone's not going to criticize their work, you know. You think, oh, the Beatles, they're universally loved. And the minute you say that, you'll find, you know, 500 guys online go, they're the worst group that ever was, and blah, 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 blah. Which I don't think will impact Paul McCartney in the least, but, you know, but the truth is nothing is universally loved. And at best, you hope maybe there's a 50-50 there. 50% of the audience will think it's great, you know, maybe a quarter will think it's okay, and a quarter will hate it. And that's fair. You know, if someone hates my work, it's not, you know, the themes, the obsessions, the things that drive me are not the themes, the obsessions, and the things that drive them. So it's not going to connect. In fact, some of those themes and obsessions may turn them off. And they're going to react negatively. That's okay. That's the nature of the beast, because I'm the same way as an audience. And as my wife will attest, sometimes we're in the movies and it's like, shh, stop it. You know what I mean? It's like, as I'm rolling my eyes and mumbling under my breath. But at the same time, you have to respect that. That any movie ever gets made is a miracle, considering everything that goes into making a film, that anything ever gets made. At least, you know, a novel, it's just one person and their story, you know. But then you think about how hard it is to sell something. And you hear all the stories, you know, J.K. Rowling, you know, how many publishers turned down Harry Potter before she sold it. I have, you know, so many projects that I held on to for years, 5 years, 15 years, sometimes 25 years before I sold them, literally 25 years. so that anything gets out there is a miracle, and let's like celebrate the things that make us happy and bring us joy and nurture us. And the other stuff, unless it's something that's morally reprehensible, here's the latest comic book by Adolf Hitler or whatever, I was, I can't, okay, let's tear that one down maybe,
right.
But most of the time you're not going to come across that. It's just some people, a person or a group of people out there doing their best to create something of value. And if you don't like it, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. So go gravitate to the things that you do like.
Yeah. And there, again, no reason to, and it's, social media is so fantastic in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm sure you feel the same way. This connection, I mean, we started talking over social media, that part of the reason that you're here today, the fact that I can do what I do for the last 10 years, talking to comic creators. You didn't have that opportunity. I didn't have that opportunity when I was, 10 years old, 12 years old. I would have loved
when
to
I was a kid,
the
big thrill was like, I'd write a letter to Marvel Comics or something, when I was a kid and a teenager, and then they printed it. Even just the idea that they were going to read it, that I had an opinion or a thought, and they read it, and then when they started printing them, it's like, oh my God, even though, it wasn't Stan doing it at that point, but it's like in your little kid head, it's like Stan Lee, or when I was a teenager, Steve Gerber, but did he read this letter? That was it. That was it. So now, and the same thing on my end. From my end, I love the fact that I have the opportunity to interact with people that read and appreciate my work, and occasionally someone pops up who doesn't, and, you sort of ignore that. And frankly, again, if you want to be respectful about it, we could have a discussion. If you want to be disrespectful, you're going to get blocked and go away. But I have to say, honestly, very rare, really very rare. 99% of my interactions with fans on Twitter and stuff has been very, very positive. People and I enjoy it. It's great. That's why I enjoy conventions. I'm not ready to go back yet because I don't trust COVID yet enough. But, to sit there and have someone come up and tell you that your work is meaningful to them, I pay them for that. One person who really gets it, who really gets what I'm trying to do and takes it into their heart, that's worth like an entire career right there. One person getting it, let alone, when I've gone to conventions in other countries and suddenly, you're in some other country, you're in Italy or whatever, and someone comes up and they, you forget that they grew up on this stuff too, and that it means something to them, and the stories have traveled around the world. Because, you're sitting in your office, you're alone with your story and your keyboard, and you forget that anyone's even going to read it, let alone that it's going to travel around the world and do what you hope it will do, which is touch somebody's heart, which is the greatest thing.
Yeah, not to get too pretentious, but it's like connection on the cosmic level,
Yeah, no, it really is. It really is. And that's how I am as an audience. When something connects with me, and certainly as a kid and a teenager and a young adult, the books and the movies that meant something, they really meant something to me. The writers that impacted my life, they will be in my heart forever,
Yeah, you take it in, it becomes a part of you.
Yeah.
Well, again, JM, appreciate the time. It's been fantastic talking to you.
This has been great. That we've gone off into some interesting side areas.
Yeah, which I love. It's a conversation, not just me asking questions and you giving answers. One last question though: if Brooklyn Dreams, it gets this new edition, it does really well. There are some hints and seeds dropped in there that you haven't gone back and done a sequel. Would you go back and do more? And
I've thought about that over. Yeah, I've thought about that over. Just a friend of mine was just asking me that the other day. I've done a couple of short stories for anthologies, which are more personal, actually, sort of me walking through the story, talking to the audience. But they were very, very specific. One was an anthology about gun control. One was a more political thing. But yeah, there's something about that is intriguing and tempting. There are certainly stories from back then that have not been told, that got cut out for space. And then, of course, there's a lot of life that's been lived since then. So it's an interesting thought. I don't have a definitive answer to it, but it's certainly an interesting thought. And I would never say, if someone came along and said, do you want to do more like this? I probably would say yes.
Fantastic.
But here's the truth. Before we finish, everything is autobiographical.
Yes.
Spider-Man is autobiographical. And I say, and it's the truth, there are things that I put into a Spider-Man story. Now it's filtered through a superhero adventure in Peter Parker, but they're just as naked and autobiographical in its way as things you see in Brooklyn Dreams. I mean, the whole point of Moonshadow was autobiography in fantasy. I took my life. It's the same story. Moon Shadow and Brooklyn Dreams are mirror images of each other. It's the same story told in two completely different ways. One is a big space fantasy, and one is quote, real world autobiography. But everything is autobiographical.
Well, it goes back to what we were just saying, right? Like the things that you've taken in, the things that become a fabric of you. Dostoevsky, he has become a part of you. And so then when you're passionate in writing a story, which again, to make it good, you have to pour yourself into it. So you take some of A, it goes into you, B, and now it's coming out as Spider-Man C. There's a part of you in that.
Yes,
you can't
absolutely.
help it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we mentioned your Twitter and interacting. Where's the best place? What's your Twitter handle?
Yeah, Twitter is at JM DeMatteis. You can go to my website, jmdmatteis.com. And I should mention, if you go to my website, you'll see I have a section for workshops, which I do on and off. I've been doing them for, 10 years or so. I did a couple online last year. I don't have another one planned right now, but they will be back. And I also have a story consultation business, which I love, where I work with writers one-on-one, go over their work. Sometimes it's comics, sometimes it's a screenplay, sometimes it's prose. And it's one of my favorite things that I get to do, to work with writers that way. So if you're interested in that, you can go to my website and read that information there. And I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, but honestly, I don't do much there, and I don't do a lot of interacting there. I'll put something up once in a while just to kind of keep it alive. My main thing is probably Twitter, and then Facebook, and then, and then of course my website.
And so, I've heard you say recently, with not that COVID made life that different for a lot of you freelancers who used to working solitary at home anyway, but
right.
You got a chance to work on a lot of creator-owned stuff. That stuff's still coming down the line.
There's a lot of stuff this year. Thanks for reminding me. I can't get into what the stuff is, but 90% of what I'm doing this coming year is all new original stuff. I've got a novella that I finished that'll be out this year, and I'm just signed a deal to do another novella. I have 5 creator-owned comics that will be coming out in different ways this year, one of which will be via my first Kickstarter, which will probably be ready in the fall. And then I'm going to be doing another for so it's a busy year.
That's fantastic. I can't wait to check it all out. So glad that you're keeping busy. We can't have enough JM DeMatteis stories, because the other thing about your work is that even though the themes may sometimes be the same, I think your body of work is very diverse. And
I try to keep it that way because it keeps it interesting for me.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at it, there's psychological superhero stuff, the funny stuff with Keith, autobiographical stuff, the creator-owned sort of weird fantasy stuff. I've done kid-friendly stuff. It's like, you got to keep it interesting. In fact, the great thing about these creator-owned series that I'm doing now, each one of them is completely different from the other. They're very, very different genres. So it's really fun to be working in all these different areas this year with a bunch of really fantastic artists and some of my favorite artists.
Yeah, that's the thing that keeps it fun, working with diverse artists as well.
Oh, yeah.
You've been very lucky to work with some of the best.
Incredibly lucky. Yeah.
Great. Well, again, thank you, JM. It's been a real pleasure. Can't wait to have you back on. Just because I've crossed you off the bucket list doesn't mean I'm not going to put you back on.
Well, you know what? Maybe when we get closer to the time for the Kickstarter,
100%.
August, September, because I'm going to need to really beat the drum for that one. We can reconvene and do this again.
Yeah, sounds great. So again, thanks so much for your time, listeners. We want to thank you for your time as well. I'll put a link to JM's Twitter as well as his website in the show notes. So if you're having trouble finding them, you can go and click there. So again, thanks for listening, everybody, and we will talk to you next time.